Omicron infections are on a visible decline here in the country, and authorities have been adjusting their COVID-19 strategy to reflect this promising reality. For more, I have Dr. Kim Seung-taek from Institute Pasteur Korea. Dr. Kim, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
I also have Professor Son Ho-jun from Seoul National University. It's been a while, Professor Son. Welcome back.
Thanks, Sunny. It's nice to be back.
Right. Dr. Kim, we'll start with you. Foreign media claims Korea may be the first country to usher in an endemic phase of this particular pandemic. When do you suppose will this be the reality?
Well, first of all, I have to talk just a little bit about just the word, the endemic. And the endemic actually, according to some epidemiology, actually indicates the status where all the all the rates are very static. I mean, neither just rising or just falling. But we are still just have to wait where the older states are very just becoming more just stable. And then sometimes there are some the misunderstanding that whether it's actually just endemic means somehow just now the virus is becoming just more just tamed, just the benign viruses. But then this is not the case all the time. But sometimes even the endemic virus, such as the smallpox virus, although the virus is declared as being just eradicated by WHO, but the virus when was actually just the spread on the globe for at least several 100 years, the virus never actually just became just the benign or just attenuated. It was still very just pathogenic and very virulent. So the endemic does not necessarily mean any just harmless viruses. But there are some other viruses like some endemic, some coronaviruses, and then some common cold. The viruses themselves there are some tendencies, I mean, some patterns while just replicating and making some mutations. Maybe just the viruses tends to just move for some better replication, which means also some better transmission, while just attenuating is just a virulence. But that's not the case the all time. So based on our experience in the past 2 years, for example, like Alpha variant and then the Delta variant, compared to some original the ancestral SARS-CoV-2, that the virus was more transmissible and more virulent. So then we have to actually just think about those kind of the facts.
Right, I see. And Professor Son, some countries are reporting rebounds in Omicron infections. What perhaps are the risks of a similar scenario here in Korea?
Yeah, so we definitely can learn from countries that have been experiencing this Omicron surge, as well as increasing proportion of BA2 variants and what they call Deltacron, right? So these recombinant variants are surging for sure, and they're taking higher proportion of new infections. Now, what's positive about earlier countries that have experienced this surge, like for example, South Africa or United States or UK, generally the trend is that the new infection rates are declining, are smaller peaks compared to the first Omicron peak. Largely, I think it's because the lineage of the new variants are similar to Omicron, so that fast immunity that we've gotten from the natural infections through really rapid surge of new infections probably taking care of some of the immunities and protection of new transmission. But the problem is that we've seen in France and UK that where there's certain lower rates of vaccinations compared to Korea or elsewhere, we are seeing that another peak after that Omicron peak, right? So that we should be still cautious. But another positive outlook is that the death rates, the mortality from the new surge is steadily declining. There's increase, but steadily declining, so that the severity of the disease may be attenuated a little bit. But again, we're still learning through these processes. We've learned a lot, but we also have to know that the new variants are arising every 6 to 8 months, really rapidly. So nothing's over yet. So we need to not let off guard ourselves of the corona pandemic at this time.
Which is why the Prime Minister has also called for more vigilance by members of the public. Right. Dr. Kim, there is talk, as my colleague Ian mentioned earlier, about a possible shortening of the quarantine time for COVID-19 patients from the current 7 to perhaps 5. What are your thoughts?
Well, as was already discussed in this program, that the 5-day actual quarantine period is now already just being applied in the U.S. This is the U.S. CDC guideline. As long as the fever is just goes away, the people can just terminate the isolation after 5 days. So I think that this decision is actually based on the socioeconomic burden, because so many people somehow just infected. So in Korea now, just more than 100, more than just 100, not more than billion people are just isolated. And then if these numbers increase, now just maybe some socially very critical, just the workforce, maybe very just limited workforce. So that this actually just considering the some kind of a socioeconomic burden. But in terms of just the virus transmission, there are some well documented just scientific evidence that most of the virus transmission occurs just like 1 or 2 days before symptom onset, and also just 2 or 3 days after the symptom. So it's like a period of like within the 7 days or 5 days, things like that. So, but then but this is just a kind of the trend. But this is not just 100%. So then the US CDC guideline is that 5 days of just isolation, and plus 5 days of some personal, just voluntary, just the quarantine, which means it's just wearing masks, especially with some other people. So depending on some our socioeconomic just burden, our government maybe just think about that. I mean, this is some prior example, especially in just the U.S. So this is something we can just consider.
Right, and also talking about consideration, Professor, so relevant officials here are also looking into the possibility of lowering the alert level of COVID-19 from 1 to 2. When should this level be lowered in your view?
Well, I think having a discussion in this direction is right. The timing is a little early because we're still in the big surge of Omicron wave, and we don't know. Each country is a little bit different, right? We can't say we're exactly the same as US or UK or South Africa. Just because the systems are different, people are different, how we respond to all of the social distancing measures are different. So it's a little too early for us to off guard. Like I mentioned earlier again. I think this level of designation in the legality issue also translates a little bit into what Dr. Kim has said about socioeconomic status issues too, that in the first degree would cover a lot of medical expenses. There's a lot of protection and support. Now, when it moves down to the second grade, there's a very explicit language about protecting people, so the coverage of medical insurance and coverage of the services, testing services. We already know that we can't get PCR tests as you used to do, right? When we have symptoms, everyone can get PCR tests. We can't do that anymore. But I think that was the right direction and move because resources were a little bit abused. We need to think really about how best to allocate our limited resources. The decision to move to the next grade is about that, but I think we also have to think about the trade-off of that decision, because when we think about socioeconomically more vulnerable people, the history of infectious disease would have said and have shown through tuberculosis or the other infectious disease that most socioeconomically vulnerable populations are the ones that are suffering the most throughout the entire history. So when these services are not covered and they're not working, or they're faced with the huge medical bills, right? They're going to be much more vulnerable to the socioeconomic challenges they need to face post-infection, or we still don't know about long COVID, so any other long-term consequences of the infection. So the discussion needs to be made in a very, very categorical and careful way, and needs to be very slowly transitioned as we observe the next waves and so on.
Right, so at this particular point in our fight against the pandemic, it's quite premature then?
It's a little mature in my opinion. I wouldn't say really premature, but it's a little early in my opinion.
Right. Meanwhile, on the topic of variants, Dr. Kim, do tell us a bit about what has been disclosed, that is, about the latest XE variant.
Well, the XE variant, according to the report, it seems to be just a recombinant between the Omicron, the early Omicron BA1, and then the stealth Omicron called the BA2. And then this kind of a recombination is not really just an unusual thing. And when the person is infected by the two different, well, in this case, not complete two different viruses, but the kind of the similar, just the coronaviruses. And then when these two viruses replicate in the same cells, there are some chances while they are replicating their genetic material, they can just combine and then just exchange some genetic information. So then this is the very just a natural phenomenon among this virus replication. So then the thing that we are actually concerned about whether this variant is actually increases transmissibility and or severity, and then how it affects our diagnosis and then the vaccines and the drugs efficacy. So in terms of transmissibility, looks like maybe it might be just enhancing some transmission, but we do not know for sure. But I think this is just a matter of just the viral fitness. So if the new variant maybe just outcompetes some other currently just circulating just virus, it might just have a chance to just some predominant virus in the future. I don't know how just soon it will be, but it is still just questionable. And in terms of severity, we still need some information about from the people who are infected by the variant. But I think maybe severity, my guess is maybe the severity will be very much like those of just Omicron or just stealth Omicron. And in terms of the vaccines and the drug efficacy, the vaccines, well, my guess is probably the same as the compared to Omicron and the stealth Omicron. And then in terms of drugs, well, this is a combination. I think still just small molecule inhibitors, which includes some Paxlovid and the remdesivir and the molnupiravir, would just still just work against the variant. But still just I think just monoclonal antibodies. Still especially for the stealth Omicron, so far only one monoclonal antibody just retains the neutralizing activity, which is the bebtelovimab, which is actually developed by the Eli Lilly. So now just more the variants coming out. Now we are losing a little bit of the weapon, especially the monoclonal antibodies, but other small molecule, just a chemical, just drug, still would still work against the variants as well.
Right, and staying with variants, Professor Son, what is your outlook with regard to the potential spread of the XE variant here on the local front?
Well, so with new dominant strains that are arising and have survived the fitness of the viral cycle, we've seen that these new variants are becoming dominant each cycle, right? So we've seen that from alpha to beta to delta to Omicron and to BA1, BA2 becoming more predominant. I think, as Dr. Kim has said, it depends on how this survives within the patients, how the patients, it transmits in our society, and the biological as well as epidemiological characteristics of the virus's transmissibility. And it's a function also of how much population have attained natural immunity, hybrid immunity, and so on, so that the transmission of new variants are disconnected, right? So if that happens, then I think we may see that attenuation of new infections from these new variants. But again, we really don't have any information. We can suspect that this will become a dominant strain if it spreads fast like Omicron. But again, I think we also have to carefully look at how this translates into mortality or number of proportion of people experiencing severe COVID.
Indeed, indeed. Dr. Kim, how high are the chances of an Omicron wave rebound in the latter half of this year when we face the colder months?
Well, I think that kind of a statement is actually based on some flu season. But the earlier in the pandemic, people just talked about some twindemic, things like that, and then in fact some co-infection might maybe just exacerbate the patient's symptoms and then prognosis. But then I think this actually just the coronavirus is actually very just very transmissible, even in like some very equatorial region, including very hot, just very warm countries. They are still just circulating very just rampantly. So we cannot actually exclude. I mean, we cannot actually just simply just conclude that this virus is very just specific only on the some cold season right now. But then I think one of the reason that we are actually talking, maybe this is might just re-emerge, maybe we just circulate on the coming just fall and winter, is that I think maybe more due to the our waning immunity. The several times I talked about the some cellular immunity. Cellular immunity will be very just long-lasting and then very robust. But our antibody levels will just decline after like a natural infection and then the vaccination. And like a couple of months later, it will just decline very rapidly. So in this case, without these antibodies, we are again just susceptible to the reinfection. And then so our immune status will actually determine how this virus will just circulate again. But right now in Korea, many people are somehow just all of a sudden we got just immunity, whether vaccination or just some natural infection. So then this immunity, our just some population level immunity, will just protect against the some maybe just a large wave of just the infection. But in the end, the antibody levels will decline. So then we will be again just susceptible to reinfection or reinfection, things like that.
Right. And keeping in mind what Dr. Kim has said, given that then, Professor Son, do you suppose we need to have additional COVID-19 vaccine inoculations?
Yeah, so actually, a New England Journal of Medicine this April 5th, I think, had an article from Israel, reporting data from Israel, about 1 million people who were vaccinated with the 4th dose. They were comparing with those who just had 3 doses. There certainly is an improvement in terms of progression to or people experiencing severe COVID. Severe COVID defined as more of a people hospitalized or ICU admissions or death. It did show that the 4th vaccination did reduce the risk of this by 3.5-fold, right? It's as significant as relative. But when we think about it in terms of absolute risk, this was very, very small. So for healthy populations in general, I think it's at this point with acquired immunity through natural infection as well as the vaccination, I think so far is okay. For people who are really immune compromised and very vulnerable populations, I think there's a benefit to that. So there needs to be a little more understanding of that, but I don't think there's a need for a widespread 4th shot for the general population at this stage.
Right. And Dr. Kim, authorities here have pledged to reinvestigate reinfection cases, which you mentioned earlier. They're taking into account the reality that reinfection cases here in the country appear to be relatively low compared to the situation in other countries. How do you respond?
Well, the reinfection cases sometimes is kind of just a little bit just challenging to identify because, well, I think as far as I know, the first reinfection case was actually officially reported in Hong Kong almost just 2 years ago. But then the reinfection case was actually observed by the border control, the border control in cases. So then the person was actually infected first, and then like 90 days or later, then in some airport, that maybe some quarantine procedure, they actually just picked up by the PCR testing. Without that PCR testing, the person would not be actually identified as the reinfected person because the symptom was almost asymptomatic or very just the symptom was almost just gone because that's due to the some natural immunity by the infection. So then that is why that we actually it is really just challenging to just detect the reinfection cases. And I think this estimating just the reinfection in Korea. Well, as of now, our just quarantine procedure and things like that, it does not probably help that much. But I think maybe for some making the future policy or some quarantine guidelines, they might just help as some fact sheet. Yeah.
I see. And now, Professor Son, finally, this is probably going to be a yes or no question. Is it true that those who suffer from breakthrough infections are less likely to suffer from a reinfection?
I would generally say yes. The data shows promising that people who've experienced multiple times and of course also vaccinated do have a much lower risk of developing much severe symptoms And we don't know yet the degree of the symptoms, like let's say a sore throat or how painful it is decreases, but certainly it's becoming a little bit less burdensome to the patients and people.
And largely because of the superimmunity that they are believed to have generated.
Yes, I wouldn't call it superimmunity, but just that they're more protected through multiple infections. It's like having cold and other.
I see.
Yeah.
All right, Professor Son, thank you very much for your insight today. Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.